Have you noticed it? The real reason everything in Tartaria is too big isn't style. It isn't rich people showing off. And it's definitely not a coincidence. Because this too big thing is everywhere. Doors so tall a grown man looks like a toy. Stairways so wide they feel made for crowds that never came. Basements with stone arches like underground cathedrals. Under buildings that were supposed to be simple. And here's the part nobody can explain, with one easy answer. It's not just one city, not one empire, not one architect. The same oversized layout repeats like a template. Street grids that line up across different rebuilds. Corridors that keep going past where the building should end. Stone blocks so tight you can't even spot the mortar lines in old photos. At first you think, okay, maybe it's just fancy design. But then you look closer, and you see the system. A system built for movement, for water, for hidden rooms, for something heavy, something planned. And the strangest part? When people dug into these places, after fires, floods, and wars, they found layers that didn't fit the story. And then the records got quiet, photos got cropped, parts got sealed again. So, here's the real question. If all of this too big architecture wasn't random, and it wasn't just beauty, what was the system actually built to do? And who needed it buried? Look at this photograph. A man is standing in a doorway. At first, nothing seems wrong. Then you look again. You place something next to him for scale. A modern door, a car, anything human-sized. And suddenly the man looks like a toy. The doorway isn't just tall, it's unnaturally tall. 2, sometimes 3 times taller than any doorway needs to be. The steps beneath him, each one rises almost to his knees. The windows behind him look big enough to swallow a full second floor. And this isn't one strange building. It's everywhere. Different cities, different countries, different centuries. The same feeling, the same oversized bones hiding in plain sight. Now, the official explanation is simple. Rich people liked big things, grand halls, tall ceilings, impressive facades. When historians explain it at all, they call it scale as status. They call it neoclassical ambition. And sure, that explanation works for one building, for one palace, for one cathedral where the goal is to make you feel small before God. But here's the part that doesn't fit. The same proportions show up in places that were never meant to impress anyone. Train stations that now sit half buried. Warehouses with ceilings so high the workers could barely touch the walls. Basements with arched stonework that looks more like an underground temple than a storage room. Nobody was trying to impress anyone underground. So why does the pattern continue down there? Let me show you what I mean. You take a photograph. Any photograph from the mid-1800s, sometimes earlier, sometimes later. You overlay a standard human figure, about 6 feet tall, and you measure. The doors come out at 14 feet, 16 feet, sometimes 20 feet. The staircases, wide enough for 10 men walking side by side. The arches, tall enough to clear a fully loaded wagon with room to spare. That's not random, that's not creative interpretation. It's a pattern, a template, as if someone, somewhere, built by a rule that no one remembers writing down. And the pattern doesn't stay inside one empire. You find it in Europe, in Russia, in the old American cities where the first stone buildings rose before anyone was keeping clean records. You find it beneath cathedrals, beneath city halls, beneath buildings marked built 1892 that sit on foundations that look far, far older. So, here's the real question. And this is where the investigation actually begins. If this oversized system wasn't about beauty, if it wasn't about showing off, and if it repeats with the precision of a code, then what was it built to do? What kind of movement was it designed for? What kind of weight was it meant to carry? And why, after every fire, every flood, every war, do the records suddenly get quiet right when the foundations get strange? That's what this series is going to examine. Not legends, not guesses, but the photographs. The building plans that survived, the measurements that don't add up, and the silence that always follows them. And in the next chapter, we're going underground, because too big isn't only what you see on the surface. The real mystery is what's buried beneath it. If you're interested in this kind of investigation, real documents, real photographs, real questions, make sure you're subscribed and turn notifications on. It supports the research, and it lets me keep making. These long-form deep dives into the stories mainstream history quietly walks past. Now, let's keep going. So, we've seen it above ground, the doors, the stairs, the windows that make the people beside them look small. But here's what most investigators miss. The too big pattern doesn't stop at street level. It keeps going downward. And the moment you follow it underground, that's when the questions get harder to brush off. Let's go beneath the surface. Picture this. You're standing at the top of a staircase. Not a grand marble entrance, just a service passage, a back corridor, something labeled basement access on an old city plan. The kind of place nobody important was ever meant to see. You take the first step down, then another. The air changes, the sound changes. Your footsteps start to echo in a way that doesn't match the building above you, and then you reach the bottom, and you're standing in a space that has no business existing. Arched ceilings, stone walls 2, sometimes 3 feet thick, corridors that run farther than the building's footprint should allow, rooms with no windows, no listed purpose, and no clear explanation in any archive you can find. This isn't decoration. Nobody decorates a basement like this. Nobody builds cathedral-like ceilings underground to impress visitors who will never come. So, what was it for? The official answer, when there is one, usually sounds like this. Storage. Coal rooms. Old foundations from earlier construction. Maybe a cistern. Maybe a crypt. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes. But the stonework doesn't match. You look at the walls, and the joints are tighter than the work upstairs. The blocks are larger, the arches are more exact, almost as if the underground level was built first, and built to outlast anything that came after. And here's where it gets strange. In city after city, when workers dig down, whether for subway tunnels, sewer, repairs, or new foundations, they keep running into the same thing: layers. Not just one buried floor, multiple floors, stacked like pages in a book nobody remembers writing, floors that don't appear on official plans, floors sealed with brick and rubble, like someone wanted them gone from memory, not just out of sight. In some places, you find windows underground, windows that once looked out onto streets that no longer exist, doorways that now open into solid earth, staircases that lead down and then end inside a wall. The official explanation is familiar: street raising. Cities lifted their ground level over time for drainage, sanitation, and flood control. And yes, that happened. It's documented. We know cities like Seattle raised their streets by about a full story. We know Chicago lifted entire blocks using jack screws. But that doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why some of these buried spaces show no signs of ever being street level, nowhere from. Constant foot traffic, no weathering from open air, no storefront traces, no signage marks, no everyday life baked into the walls the way you'd expect if people lived and worked there. It's almost as if they were sealed, not after they became useless, but from the beginning. And the deeper you go, the cleaner the stonework becomes, the more precise, the more deliberate. Almost as if the underground layer wasn't an afterthought, wasn't a basement, wasn't just support for the structure above. Almost as if the surface buildings are the afterthought, and the real system was always meant to stay out of sight. So, if too big above ground was about grandeur, what was too big below ground about? That's the question this episode keeps circling, because once you see it, once you notice the pattern continues into the dark, into the places nobody was meant to look, you can't unsee it, and you start to wonder, what exactly were they building down? There? In the next chapter, we're going to look at where this mystery first broke into public attention, a single word that launched 1,000 theories, and almost buried the real investigation under a mountain of noise. The word is Tartaria, and it's time to separate what the map actually shows from what the internet turned it into. So, we've seen the pattern: oversized doors, impossible basements, buried layers beneath cities that don't sit neatly inside the official timeline. And somewhere along the way, as people started noticing, started asking, started sharing old photographs online, a single word floated back up to the surface: Tartaria. You've probably seen it, maybe in a YouTube comment, maybe in a Reddit thread at 2 a.m., maybe in a meme that made you laugh, or made you curious enough to keep scrolling. The word comes from old maps, and I mean old. We're talking 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, back when European mapmakers were still guessing at the shapes of places they had never seen. Pull up one of those maps and you'll often find a huge region stretching across Central Asia, Siberia, and sometimes beyond, labeled Tartaria, Grande Tartaria, or simply Tartari. And here's the thing. On those maps, it can look like a country, a unified territory, an empire with borders, cities, and one clean name. But was it? The historical consensus says no. Tartaria wasn't a single nation in the way people imagine today. It was a catch-all label, a broad word European cartographers used for regions they didn't fully understand or didn't describe in detail. Not, "here be dragons," exactly, but the same kind of shortcut, written in elegant ink. The people living across those lands didn't share one identity called Tartarian. They were Mongols, Turks, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and dozens of other groups with different languages, different leaders, different histories that got flattened into one convenient word on a foreign map. So, where does the conspiracy come from? Sometime in the last 10 years, a theory appeared, and spread fast. The claim usually goes like this. Tartaria wasn't a vague map label. It was a real civilization, a powerful empire with technology ahead of its time, massive buildings, advanced infrastructure, maybe even a global reach that stretched across continents. And then, according to the theory, it was erased, scrubbed from records, its buildings repurposed, its documents destroyed, its people absorbed, renamed, or forgotten. A reset before anyone even had a word for it. Now, let's be honest, some versions of these claims are wild. Free energy towers, mud floods that buried entire cities overnight. A global conspiracy so perfect, it controls every government, every university, and every archive on Earth. If you've spent time online, you've seen the jokes, the memes, the eye rolls from historians who treat the whole topic like a punchline. But here's what gets lost inside all that noise. The photographs are real. The oversized buildings are real. The buried layers are real. The strange foundations, sealed corridors, odd alignments, and gaps in documentation. All of that exists in the physical world. It's photographed. It's measurable. It's not a vibe or a rumor. You don't have to believe in a planet-wide cover-up to notice that parts of the story don't line up cleanly. And that's what this investigation is about. We're not here to defend the most extreme claims. We're not here to mock people either. We're here to look at what the photographs actually show, what the measurements actually say, what old building plans reveal, and what they quietly leave out. Because here's the truth that both sides of the Tartaria fight often miss. The too big pattern goes far beyond any single map label. You find it in places that were never called Tartaria, in cities that were well documented from the start, in buildings with clear construction dates, sitting on foundations that feel older, heavier, and built to a different set of rules. So, maybe Tartaria is the wrong word. Maybe the map label was never the point. Maybe the point is simpler and more unsettling. Something was built, something enormous, something systematic, and the story we inherited about who built it, how it worked, and why it repeats. That story has holes. In the next chapter, we're going to stop arguing about names and start looking directly at the structures themselves. Because when you line up buildings from different cities, different centuries, different empires, and they share the same strange features, that's not a map label, that's a template. And templates don't appear by accident. So we've cleared away the noise, the memes, the endless arguments about map labels and empire names. Now we can look at the buildings themselves. And the moment you do, the moment you stop asking what to call it and start asking what it looks like, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Because these structures share features, not vaguely, not in the same general style. They share specific, repeated, almost modular design pieces, as if someone, somewhere, was working from the same playbook. Let me show you what I mean. Start with the corridors. In city after city, you find passageways that are too wide for normal foot traffic, too tall for what most people would call practical. Ceilings arched with the same curve, walls built to the same thickness, dimensions that repeat like numbers copied out of a forgotten manual. These aren't grand hallways meant for kings. They're service passages, back corridors, connective spaces between buildings that, officially, were built decades apart by different architects. And yet, they match. Now, look at the foundations, not the facades, not the fancy fronts, the bases they sit on. Stone, platforms, underground footings. In structure after structure, you find foundations that are overbuilt for what's above them. Walls thick enough to support 10 stories under buildings that rise only 3. Load-bearing strength far beyond anything the visible architecture should need. Almost as if the buildings we see were placed on top of something that was already there. And then there are the staircases. Not decorative staircases, not the grand marble sweeps in palaces. Functional stairs, service stairs, back access stairs, wide enough for a crowd, deep enough for heavy cargo, built at angles that suggest movement on a scale we don't plan for anymore. Why would a 19th century office building need a staircase wide enough for 20 men walking shoulder to shoulder? Why would a warehouse have steps sized like they were meant for giants, and ceilings high enough to lose your voice in? The official answer is usually silence. Or, if someone tries to explain it away, you get the same phrases: architectural fashion, neoclassical influence, the taste of the era. But fashion doesn't explain why the same features show up in buildings with no obvious link. A train station in Russia, a government hall in Pennsylvania, a forgotten customs house in Buenos Aires. Different architects, different decades, different empires, same bones. And here's the detail that always makes me pause: the sealed doors. In building after building, when you study old photographs, original floor plans, or notes from renovation crews, you find doors that lead nowhere, arches bricked up, passageways that end in fresh masonry where the older stone should keep going. Not collapsed, not ruined by time, sealed, deliberately, carefully. As if someone decided that whatever lay beyond was no longer meant to be reached. And the sealing often happens in the same window of time, the same decades, the same wave of modernization and renovation that rolls through cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Coincidence? Maybe. But when the pattern repeats in cities that didn't share architects, when the same kinds of spaces get sealed, buried, and quietly edited out of the official story in the same historical moment, coincidence starts to feel like the wrong word. What you're looking at isn't random, it's a system of movement, of connection, of infrastructure built on a scale that doesn't match the clean story we were handed about who built it and when. And the deeper you investigate, the more it starts to look like the buildings we recognize, the ones with dates, architects, and dedication plaques, are only the top layer, the surface, the skin. So the real question isn't who designed the facades. The real question is, what were they built on top of? In the next chapter, we're going to look at one more piece of the puzzle, the missing layer problem. Because every time a city rebuilds after disaster, the records get cleaner, but the old layers, they don't vanish, they just get buried deeper. So, we've seen the template, the corridors that match, the foundations that overreach, the sealed doors that once led somewhere nobody talks about anymore. But there's one more pattern, and it might be the strangest of all. It's what I call the missing layer problem. And it shows up almost every time a city rebuilds. Think about what happens when disaster hits. A fire tears through a downtown district. A flood pushes mud into whole neighborhoods. A war leaves blocks in rubble. An earthquake drops buildings into their own basements. What comes next is usually the same. The city rebuilds. New structures rise on the bones of the old. Streets get repaved. Paperwork gets updated. And within a generation, sometimes faster, the disaster turns into a footnote, a plaque on a wall, a paragraph in a guidebook most tourists never open. But here's the thing about rebuilding. It's fast, it's practical, and it almost never goes down. When cities rebuild after catastrophe, they build up. They pour new work on top of old work. They raise street level. They seal the lower floors and label them basements. Or they fill them with rubble, level the ground, and move on as if those spaces never existed. And the records after a rebuild always look cleaner, neater, simpler. The architect's name is easy to find. The construction date is carved into a cornerstone. Permits are organized, stamped, filed in a neat stack that makes the timeline look smooth. But what about the layers beneath the rebuild? That's where the paperwork starts to fade. You pull the plans for a building dated 1895, and the basement level is marked existing foundation. No drawings, no dimensions, no explanation of what was already there. You read renovation notes for a city hall reconstructed after a fire, and the wording turns slippery. They didn't build the lower floors, they cleared them, they adapted them. They sealed areas deemed unsafe for public access. Unsafe. That word shows up more than you'd expect. Unsafe, unstable, unfit for modern use. But the photographs tell a different story. The photographs show stonework that looks intact, arches that appear to have stood for centuries without splitting, walls so tightly joined you can't see clean seams, even in harsh light and old film grain. That doesn't look unsafe. That doesn't feel unstable. That looks like something someone didn't want opened. And this is where the missing layer problem becomes hard to ignore. When you map the disasters, the great fires, floods, wars, and demolition waves, you start to notice a rhythm, a pulse that hits cities in the same windows of time. The 1870s, the 1890s, the 1910s, city after city, destruction, then rapid rebuilding, then silence about what existed before. The new buildings get documented, the new streets get mapped, the new story becomes the only story anyone can easily find. But the old layers don't vanish, they sink. They get paved over, they become the strange voids beneath parking lots, the sealed tunnels beneath train stations, the condemned zones under civic buildings that nobody is allowed to enter. And if you ask what's down there, if you file a records request, if you dig through archives, you find gaps, missing pages, folders marked transferred to offices that no longer exist. Not destroyed, not officially denied, just gone. So, here's the new premise, the one that guides the rest of this investigation. The big architecture, the grand facades and famous landmarks, that's the surface. The real story is the system underneath. The layers that got covered, the rooms that got sealed, the history that got simplified into a clean line. And the question we need to ask isn't only what was built, it's what was buried and why. That concludes Act 1. But the investigation has only just begun, because in Act 2, we're going to stop asking what's hidden and start asking what the system was actually designed to do. Movement, water, power, and something else that none of the official explanations seem to cover. So, we've mapped the mystery, the oversized doors, the buried layers, the sealed passages, the thin spots in the records. Now it's time to ask a different question. Not what was hidden, but what it was for. Because here's the thing about the too big pattern. The moment you stop treating it like decoration and start treating it like infrastructure, the whole picture shifts. Let's start with movement. Look at any old city photograph from the 1800s. Not the posed portraits, not the clean architectural showcase shots. Look at the street scenes, the ones that catch real life in motion. What do you see? Crowds, huge flowing crowds, streams of people moving through spaces built to handle them, wide sidewalks, broad intersections, doorways that could take 50 people at once without turning into a choke point. And it's not just people, it's cargo, horses pulling wagons stacked with goods, carts loaded with materials, freight moving through cities. At a scale we've mostly forgotten, because trucks and highways push that job somewhere else. Now, look at those two big features through that lens. The wide corridors, they start to look like traffic lanes. Not foot traffic like we think of it today, but flow, continuous high-volume movement through spaces that were built not to pause. The massive doorways, not for giants, for loaded carts, for equipment, for bulky cargo that needed to pass through without scraping stone, without slowing everything behind it. The oversized stairways, not for elegance, for crowds moving both directions at the same time, up and down, in and out, without collision, without delay, without the kind of tight bottlenecks that become deadly when something goes wrong. This wasn't vanity architecture, this was logistics. And the deeper you look, the more planned it feels. Take the turning radii. In city after city, old street layouts show something easy to miss. Corners are wider than pedestrians would ever need. Intersections curve in ways that look strange on paper, until you imagine a loaded wagon making that turn. Then the geometry suddenly makes sense. These streets weren't shaped only for people walking. They were shaped for vehicles we don't use anymore. Now, take the loading bays. Behind the grand facades, tucked into alleys, side passages, service yards, you find massive openings, arched portals, ramps dropping below street level, built-in ways to move heavy goods into buildings and under them. Not just into basements, into networks, corridors that link building to building, tunnels running beneath entire blocks, a second city under the surface, designed for movement that never needed to see daylight. And here's where the pattern starts to feel unsettling. If you measure the old cargo routes, the widths, the ceiling heights, the load-bearing strength, they often exceed what the official story says was necessary for that era. Horse-drawn wagons didn't need 16-foot ceilings. Wooden carts didn't require foundations built to carry 10 times their weight. So, what was moving through these spaces? The official answer is usually silence. Or, when someone tries to fill the gap, you get vague phrases like industrial needs and commercial expansion, words that sound reasonable but don't always match the scale of what was actually built. But the infrastructure doesn't lie. You don't overbuild by accident. You don't carve long corridors through solid stone on a whim. You don't connect entire city blocks with underground passages unless you expect to use them. Something was moving through these cities, something heavy, something steady, something that required a system. Not just a building here and there, but an integrated network designed for flow. And when that system became obsolete, or when someone decided it should become obsolete, the passages got sealed, the paperwork got thinner, and the two big features were waved away as style. But style doesn't need turning radii. Style doesn't need load-bearing calculations. In the next chapter, we're going underground again, because movement wasn't the only thing this system was designed for. There's another element hiding in those buried corridors, one that may explain why so many of them were built where water flows. So, we've seen how the too big system handled movement. Wide corridors, oversized doors, turning radii and loading bays built for cargo. We don't move that way anymore. But movement wasn't the only job, because when you follow those underground passages, when you trace them beneath streets and below foundations, you keep running into the same thing. Water, not puddles, not leaks, not the slow groundwater seepage that ruins modern basements. Something else, something engineered. So, let's follow it like detectives. Start with the drains. In city after city, excavation crews have uncovered drainage systems that don't sit neatly inside the official timeline. Stone channels cut with precision, brick-lined tunnels running at steady gradients, overflow chambers sized for water volumes that seem too large for the neighborhoods above them. The official explanation is familiar. 19th century sanitation. The big sewer projects of the 1800s. Cities finally getting serious about disease, waste, and public health. And yes, those projects happened. They're documented. We know the engineers' names, but here's the problem. Some of these water systems were already there when the 19th century engineers arrived. The older records, the ones that survived, use strange, careful wording. They talk about clearing existing channels, connecting to older runs, adapting passages that were already in place, not building from scratch, adapting. And when you look at the stonework, you can often see the difference. The 19th century additions are good, solid brick, practical curves, built to last a long time. But the deeper layers beneath them, the stone channels the newer pipes tie into, can look even better. Tighter joins, smoother bends, stone worn by long flow, but still holding its shape, almost as if the water system came first, and the city grew around it. Now, let's go deeper. In some cities, workers have broken through basement floors and found something they weren't expecting. Canals, not natural streams, not simple storm drains. Actual canals, lined with stone, running under buildings that supposedly predate canal construction. Waterways that don't show up on standard maps, serve no clear modern purpose, and connect into networks that no one fully traced before parts of them were sealed again. Why would you build a canal beneath a building? The official response is usually silence, or confusion, or a quick note in a file that says, origin, unknown, and then the page turns. But the water doesn't lie. You can read it in the stone, the smoothing, the wear lines, the mineral deposits that only build up over decades, sometimes longer, of repeated flow. This wasn't one-time flooding. This wasn't a random accident. This was infrastructure. And here's where the mystery deepens. Some of these underground water channels are too deep, too clean, too precisely graded for simple drainage. They weren't built only to push water away. They were built to carry water somewhere, toward reservoirs we haven't identified, into systems we don't fully recognize, toward purposes that got buried along with the corridors themselves. And when modern engineers hit these old channels, during subway tunneling, foundation work, utility repairs, the response is almost always the same. Seal it, fill it, keep moving. Not always because it's dangerous, not always because it's unstable, often because it doesn't fit the plan. It doesn't match the paperwork. It creates questions nobody has time to answer when a construction deadline is breathing down their neck. So the old water runs get paved over, bricked up, forgotten. And the two big buildings above them keep their secret. But the water remembers. It always finds a way back, seeping through walls that shouldn't be damp, pooling in basements that were never supposed to have floors below them, whispering that something under the city is older than the city itself. In the next chapter, we're going even deeper, past water, past movement, into the spaces that might explain the strangest feature of all, the massive chambers, the underground vaults, the rooms built to hold something heavy, something hot, something powerful. Heat and power. The basement world. So, we've followed the movement. We've traced the water. Corridors built for cargo. Channels carved for flow. But there's one more system hiding in those buried layers. One that might explain the strangest feature of all. The massive chambers. Not storage rooms, not cisterns, not the kind of practical basements you'd expect beneath ordinary buildings. Something else? Spaces built for power. Let's go down one more level. Picture yourself descending past the first basement, past the sealed doors and bricked up passages, past the water channels and forgotten corridors. And then you enter a room that stops you cold. The ceiling soars 15, 20, sometimes 25 feet overhead. The walls are thick, 3 feet, 4 feet of solid stone or brick. The floor is reinforced in ways that suggest weight, serious weight, the kind of load-bearing capacity you'd build for heavy machinery. And the room is empty, no equipment, no explanation, no record of what once filled this space. The official story, when there is one, usually sounds like this: boiler rooms, coal storage, mechanical spaces for the heating systems that kept these grand buildings warm. And sure, that makes sense. The 1800s and early 1900s were the age of coal. Cities ran on fire. Every major building needed a furnace, a boiler, a place to burn fuel and push heat through pipes and radiators. But here's what doesn't add up. Boiler rooms don't need cathedral ceilings. Coal storage doesn't require walls thick enough to contain an explosion. Maintenance corridors don't get carved through solid bedrock with the precision of a surgical cut. When you compare these underground chambers to documented boiler rooms from the same era, the ones with clear plans and photographs and equipment still in place, the difference is obvious. The documented boiler rooms are cramped, functional, built to minimum specifications. Low ceilings, narrow passages, just enough space for a man to shovel coal and keep the fires burning. But the other spaces, the ones with no clear documentation, no equipment, no explanation, those are palaces, vaulted ceilings with perfect geometry, walls finished smooth, not rough like utility spaces, floors designed for something heavier than any boiler ever built, and the ventilation. Always the ventilation. Shafts running straight up through the structure, openings positioned at precise intervals, airflow engineering that suggests heat, yes, but also exhaust. The kind of exhaust you'd need for industrial processes, for combustion on a scale that doesn't match the buildings above. What was burning down there? What was generating heat, or power, or something else in these hidden chambers? The official records don't say, because officially, these rooms don't exist, or they exist only as storage, or mechanical space, or that familiar phrase again, origin unknown. But the architecture tells a different story. You don't build a room 30 feet underground with 20-foot ceilings and 4-foot walls for storage. You don't engineer precision ventilation for a space that's just holding boxes. You build like that when you're containing something. Heat, pressure, vibration, force, something that required power, and required that power to stay hidden. And here's the detail that haunts me most. In many of these chambers, the original fixtures are gone, removed, cut away from walls and floors that still show the mounting points, the anchor bolts, the scars where heavy equipment once stood. Not destroyed by time, not crumbled by neglect, removed deliberately, completely. As if someone came through and stripped everything that might explain what these rooms were for. The spaces remain, the function is erased. And in the next chapter, we're going to step back and look at the full picture. Because when you put movement, water, and power together, when you map the pattern across city after city, it stops looking like a coincidence. It starts looking like proof. So, we've traced the 3 systems: movement, water, power, wide corridors for cargo that no longer flows, stone, channels for water that no one remembers routing, massive chambers for machinery that vanished without a trace. Each one strange on its own, but together they start to form a picture. And once you see it, once you map it across cities, across continents, across the entire documented record, the picture becomes almost impossible to deny. Let me show you the board. Imagine a wall covered with photographs, hundreds of them, old street scenes, basement excavations, architectural drawings, insurance maps from the 1880s, demolition notices from the 1920s, renovation reports from last year, different cities, different decades, different languages, but the same signals, over and over again. Here's a train station in Budapest with corridors wide enough for 3 carriages side by side, and a basement level that doesn't appear on any public plan. Here's a government building in Philadelphia with foundations that could support a structure 5 times. Its height, sitting on tunnels marked sealed, origin unknown. Here's a customs house in Buenos Aires with loading bays descending 2 stories underground, connecting to passages that run beneath the entire waterfront district. Here's a cathedral in Germany where post-war excavation revealed chambers below the crypt. Chambers with stonework older than the church, older than the Roman ruins above them, older than anything in the official record. And here's where the pattern becomes undeniable. The same features, the same proportions, the same strange overbuilding that serves no purpose in the official story. Walls 3 to 4 feet thick in buildings that only rise 3 stories. Doorways 12 to 15 feet tall in spaces meant for ordinary commerce. Stairways wide enough for 20 people descending into basements that officially don't exist. It repeats like a code, not just similar, identical, as if someone, somewhere, had written a manual, a specification, sheet, a set of standards that builders followed across oceans and centuries. And the timeline keeps breaking. You find buildings dated 1870, sitting on foundations that look centuries older. You find reconstructed landmarks where the reconstruction documents only cover the upper floors, and the lower levels remain unexplained. You find demolition records that mention clearing existing substructures, but never describe what those substructures were. You find renovation notes that reference sealed areas, but never explain why they were sealed or what lay behind the brick. The pattern expands, city after city. The same bones beneath different skins. At this point in the investigation, the theory feels unstoppable. You've mapped the systems, you've documented the repetition, you've traced the silences in the archives and the seals in the stone. Everything points to the same conclusion. Beneath the cities we know, there's an older infrastructure, a system built for purposes we no longer understand, and deliberately buried by histories that chose to forget. The case feels closed, the mystery feels solved. But here's the thing about investigations. The moment you feel certain, the moment the evidence seems to line up perfectly, that's when you have to look harder, because certainty is comfortable, and comfort makes you miss things. In the next chapter, we're going to do something uncomfortable. We're going to look at the cracks in our own theory, the places where the dates don't match, the photographs that aren't what they seem, the sealed zones that have explanations, boring, human, disappointing explanations. Because if we want to find the truth, the real truth, not just the satisfying story, we have to be willing to break our own case. And what remains after that? What survives the hardest questions? That's where the real mystery lives. So, we've built the case, the systems, the patterns, the photographs that line up across cities and centuries like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. It feels solid. It feels undeniable. And now, we're going to break it. Because here's what happens when you push any theory hard enough. When you stop looking for confirmation and start looking for holes, you find them. Let's start with the dates. Some of those old photographs, the ones that seem to show impossible buildings, buried layers, giant doorways, aren't as old as they appear. Date stamps get wrong. Archives mislabel files. A photograph marked 1870 might actually be from 1910. A building captioned original structure might be a reconstruction, photographed decades after the original burned. It happens more than you'd think. And when you correct the dates, some of the mystery dissolves. That impossibly advanced stonework, built in the 1890s with documented industrial techniques, those buried floors beneath the street, created deliberately during a street-raising project with full city council approval. Not ancient, not hidden, just old, forgotten, and poorly labeled. Then there's the photograph problem. Early cameras distorted scale, lenses bent proportions. A doorway photographed from a low angle with a wide lens looks enormous, even when it's not. A man standing in shadow looks smaller than a man in light. Some of those giant features shrink to normal size when you find a second photograph from a different angle. Not all of them, but enough to make you pause. And the sealed zones. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of those bricked-up passages weren't sealed to hide secrets. They were sealed because they were dangerous. Crumbling foundations, unstable walls, flood risks, fire hazards. City engineers in the 1880s didn't have time for mystery. They had budgets and deadlines and public safety reports. When something underground became a liability, they sealed it. Not because it was ancient, not because it was special, because it was cheaper than fixing it. The records aren't missing because someone erased them. They're missing because no one thought to keep them. Basement renovations weren't newsworthy. Foundation repairs didn't make the archives. Cities were too busy surviving to document every hole in the ground. This is the moment the floor moves. The moment you realize that some of what looked like conspiracy might just be chaos, human error, bureaucratic neglect. The ordinary messiness of history that feels like a cover-up, only because no one was paying attention. And if you're honest, really honest, this is where most investigations die. You find the cracks in your theory, you feel the doubt creeping in, and you either double down on belief or you give up entirely. But here's what I've learned. The truth usually lives somewhere in between. Yes, some photographs are mislabeled, but not all of them. Yes, some sealed zones have boring explanations, but not all of them. Yes, some giant features shrink under scrutiny, but others, measured carefully, documented thoroughly, stay exactly as strange as they first appeared. So, what survives? What remains when you strip away the errors, the distortions, the ordinary explanations? That's the real question. Because after everything, after breaking our own case, after accounting for every reasonable doubt, there's still a residue, a collection of photographs, measurements, and architectural anomalies that resist easy answers. The precision stonework in places where precision shouldn't exist. The corridors that extend beyond documented footprints. The foundations built for loads that never officially arrived. If the easy mysteries are solved, why do the hardest ones remain? That's where we're going next. Into Act 3, where we stop asking what's hidden and start asking what kind of world could leave traces like these behind. So, we've broken the case. We've found the cracks, the mislabeled photographs, the mundane explanations, the ordinary chaos that looks like conspiracy if you squint hard enough. And we've seen what survives, the residue of mystery that won't dissolve no matter how much skepticism you apply. Now it's time to step back, to take a breath, to look at the whole picture with quieter eyes. Because there's another way to understand what we've found. A way that doesn't require villains or cover-ups or world-erasing catastrophes. It's called the stacked city. Here's the idea. Cities don't grow in straight lines. They don't develop according to neat timelines with clear beginnings and endings. They accumulate, layer upon layer, crisis upon crisis, rebuild upon rebuild. Think about what a city endures over centuries. Fires sweep through entire districts, floods bury streets in mud, wars reduce neighborhoods to rubble, earthquakes drop buildings into their own foundations, plagues empty whole, quarters for generations, and after each disaster, every single time, the city rebuilds. But it doesn't start from scratch. It builds on top of what came before. The rubble becomes the foundation. The buried streets become basements. The old ground floor becomes the new cellar. The previous city sinks, and a new one rises above it. This isn't conspiracy, it's survival. And it's documented. We know it happened in Seattle, where the entire downtown was razed by 1 to 2 stories after the Great Fire of 1889. We know it happened in Chicago, where buildings were lifted on jack screws to install new sewers. We know it happened in Rome, where you can descend through layers of civilization, medieval, ancient, prehistoric, stacked like pages in a book. The stacked city is real, and once you understand it, some of the mystery starts to make sense. Those buried floors, previous ground levels, paved over after floods or street-raising projects. Those sealed passages, connections that became obsolete when the street level changed. Those too tall doorways, entrances that once stood at ground level, now half buried beneath decades of accumulated earth. Not hidden, not erased, just sunk. This is the quieter explanation, the one that doesn't require shadowy forces or forgotten empires, just the ordinary weight of time, pressing cities deeper into the earth. And here's the strange thing. This explanation doesn't make the mystery smaller, it makes it bigger. Because once you see cities as stacks, as layers of crisis and repair accumulated over centuries, you realize how much has been lost. Not deliberately erased, just buried, forgotten, paved over by people too busy surviving to document what they were covering up. The fire comes, the survivors rebuild. They don't have time to photograph the ruins. They don't have resources to excavate the old foundations. They don't have energy to ask questions about what was there before. They just build. And the old layer sinks into darkness. The new layer becomes the only layer anyone remembers. 1 generation later, the buried streets become legends. 2 generations later, they become myths. 3 generations later, they become mysteries that nobody can explain. Not because someone hid them, but because survival doesn't leave room for memory. This is the stacked city truth, and it's both more ordinary and more tragic than any conspiracy. The past isn't erased by villains, it's buried by survival. But here's the question that remains. If the stacking explains how things got buried, does it explain what got buried? Does it explain the precision, the repetition, the systems that seem too coordinated for ordinary accumulation? In the next chapter, we're going to look at why the records feel so thin, and why that feeling might be more important than any single missing document. So, we've seen the stacked city, the layers of crisis and repair, the ordinary process that buries the past without conspiracies or villains. But there's still something that doesn't sit right, the records. Because even if cities bury themselves through survival, even if old layers sink naturally beneath new construction, there should still be documentation, plans, photographs, notes from the engineers who built on top of the ruins. So, why does it feel like so much is missing? Let's talk about how archives actually work. Here's something most people don't realize. Historical records don't survive by default, they survive by accident. Think about what has to happen for a document to reach us from the 1800s. Someone has to create it, someone has to file it. Someone has to store it in a building that doesn't burn down. Someone has to maintain that building through wars, floods, budget cuts, and political changes. Someone has to transfer the files when offices merge or relocate. Someone has to catalog them correctly so future researchers can find them. Every step is a chance for loss, and loss is the norm, not the exception. City offices burn. It happened in Chicago. It happened in San Francisco. It happened in countless smaller cities, where a single fire erased decades of municipal records. Plans get thrown away. Filing cabinets get emptied when administrations change. Old documents get tossed to make room for new ones. Nobody thinks they're destroying history. They think they're cleaning a closet. Departments merge. The bureau that handled construction in 1870 becomes part of a larger agency in 1910, which gets reorganized in 1940, which gets digitized in 2000. And at every transition, files disappear into boxes that nobody opens again. This isn't conspiracy, this is bureaucracy. And it explains why the records feel so thin. Not because someone erased them, but because survival, documentary survival, is the exception. The gap is the norm. But here's where the feeling becomes important, because even if we understand why records disappear, the experience of researching old buildings is still unsettling. You pull the plans for a structure built in 1890. The upper floors are detailed. The basement is marked existing foundation, not surveyed. You request the renovation files from 1920. The notes mention clearing subterranean obstructions. No photographs, no descriptions, no explanation of what was cleared. You search for earlier documentation, and you find nothing. A void, a gap where the record should be. The absence might be ordinary, but it feels like something's hidden. And maybe that feeling matters, not because it proves conspiracy, but because it points to something true about our relationship with the past. We've inherited a simplified story, a version of history that starts when documentation starts and treats everything before as darkness. The feeling that something is missing, that feeling is accurate, not because villains erased it, but because the past is always larger than what survives. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what the too big architecture actually communicated, because scale wasn't just practical, it was a language. So we've understood the gaps, the ordinary losses that make records feel thin, the bureaucratic chaos that turns missing files into mystery. But here's what we haven't asked yet. Even if we set aside the buried layers and sealed passages, even if we accept every mundane explanation, there's still a question that demands an answer. Why build so big in the first place? Because too big wasn't just infrastructure. It wasn't just cargo corridors and water channels and boiler rooms with cathedral ceilings. It was a message. Let's talk about the language of scale. When you walk into a building that dwarfs you, when the ceiling soars 5, 6, 7 stories overhead, and your footsteps echo like whispers in a canyon, something happens in your body before your mind catches up. You feel small, not intellectually, physically. Your shoulders drop, your voice quiets, your pace slows. You become aware of your own insignificance in a way that words can't produce. This is architecture as psychology, and it's not accidental. Every civilization that wanted to project power understood this principle. The Egyptians built pyramids that made pharaohs into gods. The Romans built forums that made citizens into subjects. The medieval church built cathedrals that made believers feel the weight of heaven pressing down. And the builders of the 1800s, whoever they were, wherever they learned their craft, built cities that made individuals feel like parts in a machine. Think about where too big shows up most consistently. Courthouses, buildings where law becomes physical, where the accused stands tiny beneath columns of judgment. Banks, temples of capital, where your savings become invisible against vaults of marble and bronze. Train stations, cathedrals, of movement where you flow with the crowd, directed by architecture you never consciously notice. Government halls, spaces where power lives in the proportions themselves, where the citizen shrinks and the state expands. This wasn't vanity, it was control. Big spaces don't just impress, they direct, they shape behavior. They tell you where to walk, where to stand, where to wait, where to speak quietly, and where to keep silent. You gather where the architecture wants you to gather. You flow where the corridors guide you. You feel what the proportions tell you to feel. And here's the insight that changes everything. The too big system wasn't built by one secret group. It wasn't a single conspiracy stretching across centuries and continents. It was a pattern, a repeating human pattern, a language of power that every empire, every institution, every authority independently discovers. Build big to rule big. Make the individual small, and the system becomes unchallengeable. This is the system revealed, not hidden technology, not forgotten civilizations, just power, speaking in stone. But here's the question that still lingers. If scale was a language, if the too big buildings were speaking, why does some of what they said still feel untranslatable? Why do certain features resist explanation? Even when we understand the grammar of power, that's what we'll confront in the next chapter, the honest list, the things that still don't fit. So, we've explained the scale, the language of power, the architecture of control that every civilization discovers when it wants to make individuals feel small. We've accounted for the stacked cities, the lost records, the buried layers that sink naturally beneath the weight of survival. We've broken our own case and rebuilt it with clearer eyes. And yet, there's a residue, a collection of details that resist every explanation we've offered, the honest leftovers that won't dissolve no matter how much skepticism we apply. Let me show you the list. First, the precision problem. In places where you'd expect rough functional work, basements, foundations, utility corridors, you find stonework that belongs in a palace. Joints so tight you can't slip paper between them. Curves so smooth they look machined. Blocks weighing 5, 10, 15 tons fitted together without visible mortar. This isn't decoration. No one decorates a sewer. No one polishes the walls of a coal cellar. So, why does the precision exist where no one was meant to see it? Second, the extension mystery. Corridors that run past where buildings should end, passages that continue beyond property lines, beneath streets, connecting structures that, officially, were built decades apart by different architects. You trace a basement hallway. It should stop at the foundation wall. Instead, it keeps going. Into darkness. Into spaces that appear on no plan. Not collapsed tunnels, not natural caves, built passages that extend the system. Beyond any documented footprint. Third, the alignment question. When you map certain old buildings, not all, but enough to notice, you find orientations that repeat, angles that align, axes that point toward other structures, other sites, as if following a geometry no one recorded. Coincidence? Maybe. Human pattern recognition seeing order in chaos? Perhaps. But the alignments keep appearing, in cities with no documented connection, in buildings separated by oceans and centuries. Fourth, the sealed spaces without satisfying answers. Yes, many sealed zones have mundane explanations, flooding, structural damage, budget limitations, but some don't. Some sealed passages show no damage, no flooding, no safety issues, just brick walls where doorways used to be. Fill material where corridors once continued. The sealing happened, the reason never got recorded. And fifth, the removals, the chambers stripped of equipment, the mounting points with nothing mounted, the anchor bolts. In floors that held machinery, no one documented. Something was there, something got taken away, and the record of what it was never survived. This is the honest list, not proof of lost civilizations, not evidence of global conspiracy, just questions, details that don't fit the explanations we've assembled, loose ends that resist tying, and maybe that's the most honest place to land. Not claiming we've solved the mystery, not pretending there's nothing to see, just acknowledging that the investigation stays open, that some doors remain closed, that the past keeps more secrets than we'd like to admit. In the final chapter, we'll step back one last time and ask what it means to live in a world built on layers we don't fully understand. So, here we are, at the end of the investigation, the final layer. We've walked through the photographs, the measurements, the patterns that repeat across cities and centuries. We've built the case, broken it, rebuilt it with clearer eyes, and confronted what still doesn't fit. And now, the question that matters most. What do we do with all of this? Let me tell you what I've come to believe. The past is not smaller than we were told. It's not simpler. It's not a neat timeline of progress from primitive to modern, from small to big, from ignorance to knowledge. The past is layered, complex, full of things we've forgotten, things we've buried, things we've paved over in our rush to build the next version of the world. And the too big architecture, the corridors and chambers and foundations that don't match the official story, they're not proof of one hidden civilization. They're not evidence of a single erased empire. They're something more unsettling and more beautiful. They're reminders that we've inherited a simplified story. Somewhere along the way, the full complexity got lost. The layers got flattened. The questions got answered with convenient explanations that closed the door on curiosity. And the word Tartaria, whatever you think of it, caught fire because it named a feeling that millions of people share, the feeling that something doesn't add up, the feeling that the buildings beneath our feet know more than the history books, the feeling that we're living on top of something we don't fully understand. Maybe Tartaria is the wrong word. Maybe the map label was never the point, but the feeling is real, and the feeling points to something true. We are not the first. We are not the peak. We are not the final answer to questions that have been asked for millennia. We're just the current layer, building on bones we didn't lay, walking on streets that cover older streets, living in cities stacked on cities stacked on cities. And the deeper you look, the more you realize. The ground beneath you is not solid. It's layered. It's full of sealed doors and forgotten passages and rooms that held machines no one remembers. It's full of precision where there should be roughness, extension where there should be ending, alignment where there should be chaos. And maybe the most honest response isn't certainty. Maybe it's wonder at what we've inherited, wonder at what we've lost, wonder at the sheer scale of human building and unbuilding that has brought us to this moment. If one city can hide this much beneath it, what about the next one? What about the city you live in right now? The investigation doesn't end here. It begins here, with new eyes, with a willingness to look down as well as up, with the understanding that history is not a straight line, it's a stack, and we've only scratched the surface. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, thank you. If you want to keep exploring these questions, make sure you're subscribed. It helps more than you know, and it lets me keep digging into the stories that mainstream history walks past. The past is waiting. Let's see what else we can find.